research where it would cost less. But a major part, institutionally speaking, of the funding goes to these postdocs and so on. And so could we not find inspiration to bring in more Francophones from elsewhere in Canada if we had ground rules?
To Madame Montreuil and Monsieur Montreuil for being with us. And unfortunately, Ghislaine Okumi had another commitment she had to go to. But thank you to all of our witnesses. And if there is something that we need in writing to clarify, please do submit that. And we'll do a quick change of panel. We don't have anybody online, so as soon as we get people in the seats, we'll resume our meeting. I'll just suspend just for a minute. From the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, Dr. Alejandro Adam, President, and Dr. Marc Fortin, the Vice President, Research Grants and Scholarships. And also returning to us from the Social Scientists and Humanities Research Council, we have Dr. Ted Hewitt, President, and Dr. Sylvie Lamoureux, Vice President, Research. You each have 5 minutes for your opening comments, and we will start with Dr. Tammy Clifford, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to thank the committee for having invited me here today to appear before you. It's a privilege for me to be here to support your very important work on the distribution of federal government funding among Canada's post-secondary institutions.
Health Research, or CIHR, is the largest funder of health research in Canada. CIHR serves a vibrant health research community of up to 16,000 world-class researchers annually that is more diverse than ever before and that excels across all pillars of health research, from biomedical and clinical to research on health services and population and public health. It's important for you to know that peer review underpins the fair and transparent process that we use to choose which applications to fund, protected from biases or conflicts of interest. And this means that eligible applications submitted to competitions for funding are each reviewed by an independent panel of experts in that field. These experts volunteer their time to assess and score each application, guiding decisions on how to allocate the competition's funding envelope. Through its College of Reviewers, CIHR is systematizing reviewer recruitment to identify and mobilize the appropriate expertise for the review of all funding applications and provides reviewers with the knowledge and resources necessary to conduct consistent, fair, and high-quality peer review. As we know from the report from the Advisory Panel on the Federal Research Support System, otherwise known as the Bouchard Report, for Canada to truly maintain research excellence, we must support world-class research across all regions of the country in institutions of all sizes. That is why the membership of CIHR's College of Reviewers and its peer review committees are assessed for demographic gaps, including regional representation, to balance the perspectives provided in the peer review process. Additionally, all peer reviewers are offered training to make them aware of and enable them to take actions to mitigate against several potential biases, including those related to institution size. With regard to supporting health research in Canada, CIHR recognizes that research takes place in a wide array of institutions, and for us, this includes research hospitals. To facilitate that relationship, eligible research hospitals can apply directly to us, as opposed to relying on an affiliation to another institution, such as a university. This enables research hospitals to lead world-class health research that stretches beyond the priorities of the universities with which they are affiliated, contributing to the diversification of research that we fund. It is true that post-secondary institutions account for the largest share of CIHR funding, including important research being conducted in smaller institutions across our country. However, in an effort to remove systemic barriers to accessing research funding, we have recently encouraged non-traditional institutions that have mandates to use research knowledge to improve the lives of Canadians, such as community and not-for-profit organizations, to become eligible to receive CIHR funding. We have done this by simplifying the process to become eligible to administer funding, reducing the administrative burden, and harmonizing the process across the 3 granting agencies. These non-traditional institutions may be eligible to hold CIHR funding depending on the criteria of the particular funding competition. For example, following consultations with representatives of Indigenous communities, CIHR has updated its eligibility for its flagship program, the Project Grant Competition, and since fall of 2020, individuals affiliated with Indigenous non-governmental organizations in Canada with a research or knowledge translation mandate have been eligible to apply directly to the competition. And as of right now, there are currently 11 such organizations eligible to hold funding and to host funded researchers. We know that a broad and inclusive health research ecosystem is a strength and advantage for Canadian innovation, and we are proud of the steps we have taken to broaden this eligibility. Taken together, these institutions enable the Government of Canada to support a diverse portfolio of health research. En conclusion, Monsieur le Président.
In conclusion, I can say that we will continue to adapt to new conditions, and we remain determined to strengthen the capacity for excellence in research in all its diversity, within and outside of university places and situations. I'm here to answer your questions.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am pleased to be here in my capacity as President of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, commonly referred to as NSERC. Je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion.
I thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today, along with my colleagues from SRSR and CIHR. First of all, let me start by outlining how NSERC invests its funds and our investment objectives. This will help provide more context to the question being studied by the committee.
A country of discoverers and innovators for the benefit of all Canadians. We invest in talent, discovery-focused research, and innovation through partnerships and programs that support post-secondary research in the fields of natural sciences and engineering. We provide support through grants and scholarships, with the majority of NSERC awards being allocated to individual researchers or trainees. Applications are evaluated on their own merit, and the process focuses on factors such as the excellence of the researcher, the quality of the scientific proposal, and the plan for training students at all levels in preparation for research-intensive and research-centric occupations across numerous sectors. Des experts et experts réunis par la
Experts assembled by NSERC follow a rigorous peer review process. Evaluation is carried out irrespective of variables like language of the application, career stage of the applicant, and institution size. NSERC follows an international gold standard for research evaluation. That said, we do understand that differences in institution size can have a potential impact on the adjudication process.
Representation during peer review, NSERC solicits expert input from domestic and international reviewers from institutions of all sizes and regions and at various stages in their careers. How reviewers evaluate contributions also helps safeguard against potential biases in the review process that could favor larger institutions. In their applications, researchers are encouraged to highlight items such as service to and engagement with the community, mentoring and promoting the importance of science to youth and underrepresented groups, or even public policy work that informs decision makers. This expanded scope of contributions being assessed reduces barriers and enables researchers to highlight the importance of their work regardless of their geographical location or size of institution. Le SRSR surveille de près la répartition des fonds.
NSERC closely monitors the distribution of its funding awarded and applications received. We actively look at the profile of applicants for factors such as the language of applicant, the career stage of the applicant, and whether they are from an underrepresented group. As with a peer review, the goal is to ensure that awards benefit a diversity of Canadians and do not create or amplify any widespread gaps.
As mentioned, NSERC's internal standing committees, such as the Committee on Discovery Research and the Committee on Research and Technology Partnerships. These committees provide strategic advice and direction on pressing issues facing the agency. The committees intentionally comprise representatives from institutions that vary, for example, in size, primary language, and geographic location. A diverse committee membership helps ensure that input is balanced, fairly represents feedback from the research community, and pertinent to the question being studied by the committee, ensures that all institutions have a say. Le SRSR a pris les devants en reconnaissant.
A diverse community membership helps ensure that input is balanced, fairly representing feedback from the research area.
From smaller institutions. For example, the Discovery Development Grants provide resources to researchers from small universities. Each award has a 2-year duration and provides recipients with resources to build their research program. The Undergraduate Student Research Awards program, which supports more than 3,000 students annually, has awards set aside specifically for small institutions. Lastly, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Institutional Capacity Building Grants were only made available to small institutions and colleges. J'espère que l'information que je vous ai communiquée aujourd'hui.
I hope the information I've given you today will help you in your discussion. I will be very happy to answer any questions that you may have or to listen to any observation you may have with respect to answer.
Thank you very much. And now to Dr. Hewitt for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this important study.
Today by saying how pleased I am to see the new sign in front of my place, and also the new investments in research proposed in the last federal budget, and how positively this news has been received across the communities that we serve. Le rôle principal de SRSR.
Our primary role at SHRC is to support research training, and knowledge mobilization in humanities and social sciences. In addition, we have been mandated to deliver a suite of prestigious in-agency programs, such as the Canada Research Chairs Program and the New Frontiers Program.
SHRC grants are awarded to students, researchers, and research teams following expert or peer review conducted in accordance with global best practice. These awards are administered by Canada's post-secondary institutions, the central pillars of the Canadian research ecosystem, which receive their mandates and operating funds primarily from the provinces or territories. Research is just one component of their mandate, albeit an extremely important one. As you are all well aware, post-secondary institutions come in all sizes and are oriented to diverse missions, from our very large and complex research institutions that offer extensive graduate training, to smaller universities and colleges that focus primarily on undergraduate or vocational education. Indeed, SHRC has a special relationship with these smaller institutions in particular, as they often tend to have a higher concentration of social sciences and humanities researchers and faculty. Le programme de financement de SRSR.
Our funding programs at SHRC are designed to support research across Canada at post-secondary institutions of all sizes and missions. In some cases, our programming provides the necessary investments to build world-class centers of research expertise that compete on the world stage. In others, SHRC funding can play an important role in addressing regional issues or strengthening services to local communities. In all of this, SHRC works to ensure that research we fund contributes to Canada's innovation agenda by building a more inclusive and representative research community, enhancing support for early career researchers, promoting research conducted in both official languages, and strengthening Indigenous research and research training capacity.
Closely monitors the distribution of its funding to ensure that all Canadians benefit from public investments in research. Periodically, we adjust to new realities and identified gaps in the research ecosystem. One such gap we have identified relates to differences in application and success rates for smaller institutions relative to larger ones. Larger institutions that are well supported by their provincial governments, have access to resources that allow them to recruit research-intensive faculty, graduate students support, and assistance in preparing research grant applications, both domestically and internationally. On the other hand, in accordance with institutional priorities or missions, teaching loads at smaller institutions can limit the time that faculty may engage in research. Faculty also may have more limited access to graduate students and other trainees that support the research process. So to help level the playing field, SSHRC has introduced a range of practices over the years. For example, to ensure fairness in adjudication, we routinely work to ensure that expert review panels and committees include representatives from a range of institutional types. We also provide block grants to institutions that they may use to help build research capacity, as well as special supplements to smaller institutions. Within the Canada Research Chairs Program and the Research Support Fund, progressive formulae are applied to make sure that the minimum applications or funding are reserved for smaller institutions. Je peux vous donner plus de détails sur ces mécanismes.
I can provide more details on these and other mechanisms to employ our support for research at institutions from coast to coast. And of course, I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have about SSHRC's programs and mandate and its relationship with post-secondary institutions. Thank you.
Hewitt, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here and for staying with us for the meeting. This will be our last hour of this study, and it'll be important for your testimony to be a part of the study. And we'll start with Ms. Rempel-Garner for the first 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here and for your work. So removing barriers to equality of opportunity for diverse researchers is important to me. So I'll begin by focusing my questions on the Tri-Council Self-Identification Questionnaire that was established in 2018 and is now a requirement, I believe, for applicants to be eligible for federal research funding. In filling out this form, could an applicant's race, gender, or sexual orientation be used to either disqualify them or qualify them for a federally funded position or research funding?
The short answer to that is no. This is a tool that we use to collect information on applicants. It is completely voluntary. You can refuse to respond to the questions that are there if you wish. It is not used in the peer review process, but it helps us better understand who is applying, what their background is, how the outcome of the peer review process turned out for them, so that we can better monitor, better understand maybe where there are systemic biases in the system.
So there have been several high-profile cases of complaints related to the Canada Research Chair Program using essentially race-based hiring processes. Is in those positions are gender, sexual orientation, or race used to either qualify or disqualify candidates from those positions?
So in these cases, as you may be aware, members of the committee are aware, we pursue policies that were established in law by the federal court and subject to a mediation that was overseen by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Those policies are contained in an addendum to the program and are set to ensure that by the year 2030, the Canada Research Chair Program will look more like Canada in terms of the distribution.
Perfect bridge into my next question. So those targets state that by December 2029,
right.
Women and gender minorities must make up close to 51%. 22% must be visible minorities, and 7.5% must be people with disability. 4.9% must be Indigenous. As of September 2023, roughly 48% were held by women and gender minorities, 28.6% by racial minorities, 7% by people with disabilities, and 4.1% by Indigenous scholars. So we're close. Is there a plan to remove race-based or gender-based hiring practices once those targets are hit?
So that's a very good question, because we are under the mandate of the federal court, under the mediated settlement that was overseen by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So I would say that would be a very happy outcome, and I would be the first person to entertain the discussions that might see the elimination of the need to be doing that.
Have the Tri-Council undertaken any work to articulate what conditions would have to be established for those hiring practices to be eliminated? And has that work been communicated to the federal government?
So right now, we operate under the terms and conditions that were set by the federal court and the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So
but I'm asking you, has any work been done by the Tri-Council to either set the conditions by which race-based hiring targets or practices would be eliminated?
I think we want to get to the targets first and then have the conversation
But
about
we're
whether
close.
we would need
We're
them.
there, right?
Well, we're not quite there.
We're really close.
We're not quite there, and a
So
lot
there
can
has
happen
been-
in the
there's been
next
no-
few years.
Just
There's been no
through the
work yet.
chair, if I could
Thank
try
you.
and...
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that work hasn't been done yet. So in a 2024 news article, Wilfrid Laurier, University biochemistry professor, stated that Laurier's University Inclusive Excellence Program aimed to hire 6 Black and 6 Indigenous faculty. Long story short, they had a Black applicant apply, no Indigenous persons applied, it was for an Indigenous person, and so the position was essentially let go. What safeguards have the Tri-Council put in place to ensure that minority groups aren't pitted against each other in race-based hiring practices?
We set the targets. We work with the institutions so that locally they can set the targets for their particular institution and the mechanisms that they would use under the laws of Canada to achieve those targets.
So you're really hamstrung by the law right now, and you're saying that the law doesn't really allow for those types of safeguards to be put in place.
I'm not sure I understand the question in terms of safeguards. I mean, we're looking to achieve certain objectives with respect to the program. We are operating under the rulings of the Federal Court and the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
So
I think we're talking more in terms of how we're acting proactively to make sure that the representation is in place.
Thank you.
As opposed to safeguarding in other respects. I mean, at this point...
That's very helpful. So, Mr. Hewitt, the committee recently received notice of the order in council that enabled your reappointment to your role.
Mm-hmm.
Were Tri-Council EDI policies applied to your reappointment?
I have no idea. I applied for the position, I received it, so that
If
might be
we
a question
apply-
for those who were responsible
If
for
the
that
government
appointment.
applied Tri-Council EDI rules,
Mm-hmm.
like the rules your agency uses for funding allocation to you, would you have been reappointed?
That would very much depend on who the other candidates were.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that for me?
I have no idea who the other candidates were.
Okay, that's very interesting.
How would
so-
I know? Right?
so-
I mean,
so-
that would be a confidential process.
So we don't know if your own agency's DEI targets were applied to your reappointment.
I'm appointed through
Based on
governor
merit?
and council process, so I'm not appointed by the agency. I'm appointed by the Government of Canada through the GIC process.
Thank
So
you.
those would be questions for those who manage that.
Thank you. A good discussion, and just a reminder to address the comments and questions through the chair would be helpful so we don't get into the back and forth banter that could happen. Didn't this time. To Ariel Carabega, please, for the next 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I also would like to welcome our witnesses to this committee and thank them for the work that they do. I had a question for Mrs. Clifford. In your remarks, you mentioned these smaller non-traditional institutions that can apply. Can you give an example of what kind of smaller institutions these are? And what's the process? And how many have applied and received funding? I'll follow up questions after that on your answer.
Sure. Thanks so much for this question. And maybe on the latter part, I'll follow up with you afterwards in terms of the numbers of those who have applied. One example would be ITK. I think the members of this committee would be familiar with it, Inuit organization. They recently applied to be eligible to apply for and hold CIHR funding and were successful in satisfying those requirements. To give you an idea of what's required, and again, this would be for any institution in the country, big, small, traditional or non-traditional, we require that they're engaged in research, including a knowledge translation mandate, or research training and related activities. They're based in Canada, and they submit supporting documentation. And it's that supporting documentation that speaks to finances, largely speaking. So, do they have sort of the support available in the organization to be able to handle and manage the documentation that we do require? For example, financially audited statements. These organizations are also they sort of reapply, or their eligibility is reviewed. I shouldn't say reapply. Their eligibility is reviewed every 5 years, and it's on the basis of being able to continue satisfying those requirements vis-a-vis the financial reporting. The institutions also sign an agreement, and in doing so, signing that agreement, they commit to developing and implementing policies, administrative systems, procedures, and controls needed to comply with the requirements of receiving federal funding. So, again, we're open to those large or small, traditional or non-traditional, and there's a very well articulated process for those to follow. And happy to provide you with the numbers in terms of what that distribution is and over time. They do go on. I should say it's not just an application to be eligible to receive the funding, but in fact, researchers affiliated with those institutions have gone on to, in fact, hold CIHR grants themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could just ask one last question on that, what is the threshold criteria for them to qualify as a non-traditional? I mean, you did talk about the funding. I'm curious to know when they are applying and receiving funding, what is the demographic you're looking for, and how many of them are maybe Francophone or other racialized communities?
Excellent question. And again, there's no threshold in terms of size, whether it's number of staff, number of teaching staff, research staff, the size of the community. In fact, it's anyone eligible to apply for. And again, in terms of those demographics, we are able to get those in terms of a breakdown according to Francophone, geographic location across the country. Very happy to provide. The good thing is we love data. We have a lot of it, and very pleased to be able to share to inform this committee's very important study. Thank you again.
Absolutely. I actually, if you do have some stuff that you could submit to the committee, I would really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
I'm going to go to Mr. Hewitt, just kind of going back to what my colleague was asking around the safeguards to protect some of these demographics that you have set to make sure that they also receive, they're equally included. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? I don't think I heard the answer, and I just wanted to see what are the safeguards that are in place to keep the targets that you have set, your organization has set, to make sure that there isn't a change on that.
We have about a minute.
So under the requirements of the program, certain targets were set with institutions in accordance with their local circumstances to ensure that positions were filled to proportions that were established under the addendum within the agreement that was set by the federal court. We work with the institutions to develop targets and thereby encourage them to use whatever hiring practices are allowed under the laws of Canada and provinces in order to achieve those. So it's up to the institutions to find ways to do that. In some cases, there are no issues. They have open calls, they hire candidates. All these candidates are approved by the Canada Research Chairs Program on the criterion of excellence once they're nominated by institutions.
Sorry, maybe I didn't ask my question the right way. I'm just trying to understand, in order to keep the continuity of them receiving, keeping the criteria.
We are out of time.
So they're monitored over time. And
maybe if, Mr. Chair, if I can get that in a response through the committee, written response would be great.
I was going to ask for that. Very good.
I'm happy to repeat my question, Mr. Chair.
Now to Mr. Blanchette-Joca for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My first question will be for Ms. Clifford. When it comes to the concentration of funding for research in a small number of universities, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research are the institute where we seem to have a big issue in terms of the equilibrium of financing. So how can you allow smaller institutions to develop research centers in these conditions?
Merci pour votre.
Thank you for your question.
Perhaps I could speak a little bit more generally to support for Francophone research at CIHR. I can say that within my tenure at CIHR, which is about the past 5.5 years, we have implemented some changes, some, not perhaps all that we need, some changes in order to support health research and Francophone health researchers. For example, we all know that it takes a little bit longer to write things en français than in English. And so one of the first things that we did maybe about 5 years ago was to provide about 20% more space for Francophones to convey their study methodologies in the application. For our peer review committees, which again I mentioned earlier is a critical part of how we determine where our funding goes, we are also providing translation services at all stages of the process, and from application all the way on through to peer review. Perhaps most importantly, in 2021, with our flagship project grant competition, we implemented what we call equalization. And so that provides an ability for us to ensure that the proportion of successful grants is at least equal to the proportion of grants that have been received, in this case in French. So for example, if 15% of the applications come in from in French, 15% of the grants that are awarded will also go to that population. Again, to know though that there is more to do.
Madame Clifford, je vous arrête là-dessus, puis je reconnais.
Ms. Clifford, I know about all the initiatives that you could undertake to improve the presence of French in these applications, but you are no doubt aware of the fact that researchers of French language, who represent about 25% of the population in Canada, 50% of these researchers make their requests in English. So you can tell me that you're equalizing number of the amount of the funding, but we know that 50% of them are filing in English because they seem to have a higher success rate when they file in English. It's especially at CIHR that they have a higher rate of success when they file in English. I do understand the efforts, but we still find ourselves in a situation where there is discrimination against French language researchers when it comes to accessing funding for research and carrying out research in French. So I'll go back to my question. How would you explain the fact that 90% of the funding goes to 15 universities coming through your institute? So excellency could be repeated, and this seems to be an ideological way of thinking, but it goes to 15 big universities, and the remaining, all of the other universities in Canada, they only get 10%. So how can we face societal issues when we are concentrating the funding on university centers, only 15 institutions in Canada?
Merci.
Thank you for clarifying.
HR, when we take a look at who receives our funding, certainly there is the U15 group and the affiliated institutes. We also look to research hospitals, as well as the small and medium institutions and the other organizations that I mentioned in terms of the previous question. I guess I would try to clarify the difference between the number of grants received versus the amount of grants received, because there is a qualitative difference in the size of grants for different kinds of research. For example, I'm trained as an epidemiologist, so I don't require a lot of equipment, but of course we know that some medical research does. Right. My point here is that we do see strength in smaller and medium-sized universities in health research that is not as equipment intensive, if I may say. So it is a recognition of the strengths of the smaller universities in terms of the social, environmental, and cultural aspects of health research, which are very, very critical to our ability to profiter, to benefit most.
Madame Clifford, je vais revenir sur l'essentiel de ma...
Ms. Clifford, I'll go back to the essence of my question. When it comes to the distribution of funding for research in Canada, how can we make it more fair for small and medium-sized universities so that they can develop themselves in the field of scientific research in health through the CIHR? So that is the issue, because there's a vicious cycle where the bigger you are, the higher the chance you have of obtaining funding. But should we all go pack up and move to Toronto?
Very briefly.
Sorry, Chair?
Sorry, very brief answer, please.
Very brief. CIHR has many different funding programs. I've mentioned the project grant competition, which has about a 20% success rate across the country. Strategic funding has higher success rates, and in fact, that is where I would encourage all institutions to consider applying. Again, once you receive your first grant, it does become easier to get subsequent grants, of course, because you have that track record, if you will. Merci encore.
Great. Thank you. To Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm going to stay with Dr. Clifford for the moment. You mentioned that research hospitals can apply directly for funds. I guess I'm a bit, I don't know what, ignorant maybe the word, about how all this works. I assume these research hospitals are, or at least most of them, are connected with a university. Is that the case?
Yes, it is. I don't have the data as to whether I would say all of them, but I would say most of them would be affiliated with, let's say, a parent university, if you will. However, at CIHR, we do, the research hospitals are able to apply directly to us as opposed to having to go through their affiliated university.
And would that be, when they're applying for funds in that method, would that be institutions applying for funds for strategic grants or something, not individual researchers applying for project grants? Is that the difference there?
It would be both. It would be both. And so in some cases, a researcher, a professor may have an affiliation at more than one institution. And again, then it is up to the researcher to identify on that application who is their parent institution, if you will. So it provides, though, flexibility, because what we have seen and what we hear in health research is because universities serve a wide variety of research interests, health topics may not be necessarily prioritized by the university. However, they would be by the research hospital.
Right. Okay, I think that clears it up for me. I'll turn to Dr. Adam and about NSERC. We've heard from many of the smaller colleges and other institutions about their particular strengths. A lot of them are being able to do flexible research projects brought to them by industry, for instance, but they have had, at least in the past, difficulty in applying for NSERC grants to match those funds or support that in research because the timelines don't match. Now, we heard something, I think, in our last meeting that has been addressed by NSERC, hopefully, so that there is more flexibility in timelines, in when there's intake periods, so that if an opportunity comes up, the application can go right in and hopefully get quick approval. Is that something that NSERC can do for those smaller institutions?
Well, thank you for the question. So we run the Community College Innovation Program for the 3 councils, and that's dedicated for the colleges, polytechnics, and CEGEPs. And it has been growing quite a bit over the years. In fact, it's the program that's grown the most over the past 10 years. Still insufficient given the demand, but we are in continual contact with the stakeholders to create conditions that favor the sort of delivery which is appropriate for that sector. And the partnerships that they have with industry, with communities, of course, are stellar and a key foundation as to the work that they do. So I think that issue is being addressed, but on a continual basis, we're in touch with that community and seeking to always tweak the programs to address the specific needs of the stakeholders.
Okay, and I'll move to Dr. Hewitt. And you mentioned that SHIRT gives block grants to small institutions. What's allowed to be charged under those block grants. We hear a lot about small institutions just lacking the capacity, lacking the overhead, the administrative costs. Is that something they can put in or use directly from those block grants?
Well, and for us, that is precisely the issue. I mean, we're going to fund excellence wherever it exists. And in many cases, in smaller institutions, they lack the resources for whatever reason to be able to assist faculty in making applications to the agency. So what we do is we provide the block grants, and they can be used for anything that's eligible under our funding. It's typically used for smaller grants that are adjudicated locally by peer review below the value that we would normally offer. So you can get a grant of $5,000, $6,000 to help start your research and develop the base for a larger application. It could be used for travel to conferences. It could be used for developing capacity within the institution to mentor or to provide support. So it's a very broad range of activities, particularly tied to the needs of the local institution to help them increase the number, which can be quite small, and the prospects for success of these institutions.
And so it's the institutions that apply for these grants?
They don't need to apply. The money's distributed on a formula, and there's also extra money for the smallest of the institutions that they receive automatically that they can apply for these purposes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And to Mr. Tucker for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Hewitt, you became president of SHRC in 2015. You got reappointed. I was encouraged with your testimony that you guys review the expert review panels and that you closely monitor funding of students, and that's encouraging to hear. And I got a couple of comments about a media report that came out in April of this year. It's last month on the 27th of April. In this report and with SHRC funding, one of the policies is not to support partisan activities, I'm assuming, correct? And
well, we would, absolutely.
So your organization wouldn't have funded a group that says, don't vote for Liberals. That would be too partisan for you.
I would suggest that's correct, yeah.
So how would you explain the report in the media that left-wing fact-check, this is the title, left-wing fact-checker fined for targeting Scheer, that SHRC funds went to an organization that put out a voting guide that recommended voting against the Conservatives in the 2019 election.
Yep.
You didn't fine them, but you funded them. How much money went to this group?
So I can't remember the exact amount. It's on the order of tens of thousands of dollars. It went to fund the research, not the guide, which we found to be in contravention of our policy. And we informed the institution that in no way should any publicity or notification around the use of that guide mention the word or the logo of SHRC, because we did not fund the guide. We funded the basic underlying research that might have been used for the guide. The institution made the corrections.
Did you get the money back, or did you ask for the money back?
No, we did not, because the money was not used for the guide. The money was used for underlying research that may or may not have been used in the guide.
So that guide was paid for by the university then?
It was not paid by us, sir.
It wasn't paid by SHRC?
Absolutely not.
So when you reviewed this, you read the report or the story. Did you call in the people that approved this funding and review that process that they went through?
Absolutely, because we wanted to know what the background was initially for the funding that had been accorded to the institution. We also talked extensively to the institution and to the researcher through the institution.
And could you, in writing after the meeting, put forward any members of that panel that approved this funding?
It would have been done internally at the time, so I can certainly investigate how it would have been done, but in accordance with the investigation that we would have done at the time, it was absolutely in accordance with our process.
So
what we had issue
you're not
with...
supportive of this at all, then? Obviously.
No.
What steps have you put forward that would stop this from happening again?
So one of the things that we have done is to say that in cases where we find our logo, there are rules and standards that are used associated with the use of our logo. And we have told institutions that if we feel the logo is not being used appropriately, we will withdraw permission for institutions to use the logo.
Just on the branding, that's what you're worried about, or the funding?
We did not fund it. We do not want it branded as having funded it. So we want to make sure there's no confusion in that regard.
But you funded research that went into a partisan guide.
The research was fine. by our standard. It was the use of the research in the guide and the use of the logo to signify that somehow we had supported the guide that we objected to.
But it's not just the logo that is the problem. It's the dollars that are flowing to an organization that is doing research in a partisan way. And it doesn't sound like, other than protecting your logo, there hasn't been any other steps to stop this from happening again.
Well, the research that was funded under our processes. Some of that research might have been used somehow to create the guide, but the research itself was done under the auspices of the university in accordance with its processes as well. There was no issue with the research itself.
There's no problem with so this did surprise you, though, the reports and finding out that perhaps that surprised you. But you said did you personally look at the research that they did?
I was involved in ensuring that the institution did a proper review, and I was certainly involved with the conversations with the institution and the researcher to make sure that our money was not used in a partisan way.
Was there a report generated that you received on that research from the institution?
I'm not sure there's a report. There's correspondence that would be available.
I'd like to see the correspondence of them
Sure.
explaining the research and the research itself, because this is questionable. We have cost of living crisis across Canada, which is hurting the amount of research that is done at our post-secondary institutions. And here's an example where tens of thousands of dollars went to questionable research for partisan reasons that every group that comes in here looking for additional dollars, well, there was additional dollars in SHRC that went to research for partisan reasons.
It was not in our view.
Okay, I think
I reject that.
we'll move on to the next 5 minutes with Ms. Bradford, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. It's wonderful to have the three Tri-Council funding agencies here together in person. So this is a question I'd like each one of you to answer from your perspective. On April the 18th this year, Dr. Dana McMartin of the University of Lethbridge told this committee that members of review committees responsible for awarding funding have to pass judgment on the institutional capacity of institutions. In her opinion, this review criteria poses a problem as the experts are not in a position to make these judgments. So do the evaluation criteria based on the host institutional capacity cause inequitable funding decisions, and what adjustments could be made to the peer review process? So I don't know whether we want to go left to right or right to left or middle.
Ladies first.
I'll start first if you want.
Sure.
So we're always checking for biases and distortions in the review process. I don't know how familiar you are with the Discovery Grant system. So we have hundreds of committee members evaluating them. We had 3,000 applications this year, and we awarded over 2,000 grants. So questions are asked about institutional capacity. Those would be mostly, I believe, for experimental, sort of large scale, and whether that is feasible. But I would agree with the comment that this would not necessarily always be, it's a difficult call in some cases, right? So we have members of our staff who are there and are always sort of reminding the committees that they shouldn't go in those directions. Of course, no system is perfect, but we are proud of the fairness of our granting system, and those issues have been flagged to us. And we're continually working with the community. We're in direct contact with them to try to continually have the best practices. And so it's a very good point and something which we are continually trying to mitigate.
Thank you.
And perhaps if I could just add on, I agree with Dr. Adem's comments as well in terms of the peer review committees that we have. For our project grant competition, we've got about 60 peer review panels that operate twice a year. We do have members of staff who are at those peer review panels, and we are monitoring for comments that might suggest bias according to institutional size as well as some other elements. To Dr. Adams' point, though, these applications that are submitted to us do receive institutional sign-off, and when the institution or the university itself signs off on it, they are effectively saying, we're able to do the work. So is it a perfect system yet? No. But through monitoring and through the training that we do provide for peer reviewers, we're working to be able to address that particular potential bias as well as others.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Mr. Hewitt?
Yeah, similar response. Interesting. My first position was at the University of Lethbridge, actually, so it's a place I know well. A smaller institution, by the way. I would say, similar processes in place. We try to keep committees representative broadly, so there are people from larger institutions, smaller institutions. We have a system of observers as well who sit in committees. These are academics who don't participate, but they listen, and they provide reports where they believe there are anomalies or issues. Peer review is not a perfect process, as we all know. We can learn from this at the end of the day and make sure that instructions to committees are taken appropriately to make sure that certain things do not happen and certain assumptions are not made. This is what we do, basically.
Okay, well, thank you. So continuing with you, Mr. Hewitt, the grants from the Research Support Fund, which helps the institutions finance the indirect costs of research, are calculated based on the funding institutions have received in the past.
Yep.
The program provides for higher percentages for institutions that have received less funding. This mechanism does not apply to the research security component fund, and the committee heard that smaller institutions receive small grants. To be eligible for research security funding, institutions must receive at least $2 million in direct research funding from the granting agencies. Should this threshold be changed?
Are you asking in my opinion?
Yes, right. That's all you can offer,
I think it
right?
should be reviewed. This was a decision that was taken in consultation with the department to whom we report, and that would be the Industry, Science, Economic Development, or what we call affectionately ISED. That was the decision that was ultimately taken in order to make best use of the funds in their view at the time. But should we be reviewing that? Absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Blanchet-Choquette, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for all three witnesses who are with us. We heard from many witnesses about their concerns when it comes to funding that is offered to Francophone researchers. Some recommendations, especially one from the Canadian Federation of Students and Francophone institutions, they agreed with the idea of recognizing Francophones as an underrepresented group. In other words, the funding they receive now is inferior to their demographic representation and to the percentage of the teaching staff across Canada. So I'd like to hear you on that. Could we introduce criteria to set aside specific pots of money to ensure the vitality of research in French?
Pour assurer.
To ensure the vitality, that would be the right word. But there is a mechanism funded by University of Sherbrooke, and we will also develop other mechanisms to work on this issue of grants offered to French research. My question is, would you agree that there should be criteria? Because there are no criteria. I understand that you're explaining to me what you're doing right now, but it doesn't seem to work because we're not at equilibrium yet. So we're just looking to find solutions. Right now, Francophone researchers in Canada are at a disadvantage because there's a concentration of funding for research in the university network among Anglophone universities. 90% of research is in the hands of 15 universities. So there's a big issue here, and Francophones are having to seek refuge in Anglophone institutions, or they find obstacle after obstacle. So I'd like to hear you as representatives, as the guardians of funding for research in Canada. Would you agree that a certain proportion of the funding should go towards reestablishing the equilibrium in this field? The balance. Well, that's something that should be studied, that we will study with our colleagues and with ACFAS. Mr. Adam? Thank you. Only 4% of grant submissions were made in French since 2014, and only 8% of the applicants indicated or selected French as their language of correspondence.
A brief comment from Dr. Clifford.
Oui, il faut que nous
Yes, we should consider it.
Thank you. The final 2.5 minutes, Mr. Cannings.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I think we're in your final minutes as chair, I just wanted to personally thank you for your work here. You've done a remarkable job, so thank you very much. I'm going to go back to Dr. Clifford again, just to wrap up this, get my mind around how the CIHR works with research hospitals. Is there some way that a university also having a research hospital, yes, it makes it obvious that it'll attract more funding from CIHR because it has that hospital, but just the fact that both the university and the research hospital and presumably the associated researchers that may be tied to both those can all apply. Is there some way that kind of amplifies the possibility that those institutions will get more money than smaller institutions?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and I might need to go back and look at, the distribution of the research hospitals and then their affiliated institution. But theoretically, perhaps. But in terms of health research, if you were, for example, to speak to Healthcare Can and those who are active in the health research space, they would very clearly articulate the importance of being able to apply directly as, a health institution as opposed to being a university, given the wide variety of priorities for a university. I'd happy to go back and kind of look at the linkages between the research hospitals and the universities and kind of with our funding analytics team and be able to tease out a little bit better around that. It's a very good question. And I did start my career after I finished my schooling at the CHIO Research Institute. Also had an affiliation with the University of Ottawa, and at the time, I didn't really think too much about it, but obviously now I'm in the midst of it. So appreciate the question.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and for staying so that we could hear your testimony today. As I said at the beginning, it was very important to hear from you, and certainly you've given us some more details for the analysts to work with. Before we adjourn today,